Picture the marble columns of Athens, shining in the sun. Philosophers debating in the agora, citizens gathering to cast their votes, proud to call themselves free men in the world's first democracy. The city, bathed in golden light, was celebrated then and remembered now as the cradle of civilization. But beneath that brilliance lay shadows the world was never meant to see. For every speech about justice, there was a silence imposed on those who could not speak. For every statue carved in marble, there were unseen hands, blistered and bleeding, forced to shape it. And for every free citizen who proclaimed the ideals of equality, there were women whose very existence was erased from the promise of freedom. They were the enslaved women of Athens. Foreign captives taken in war, young girls stolen in raids, mothers sold in markets where their names were forgotten the moment the hammer fell. To the world, Athens represented liberty and progress. To them, it was a prison with no walls, only chains that bound body and spirit alike. Democracy, the word that still carries hope today, was never meant for them. Their labor kept the houses running, their silence protected the honor of families, and their suffering was ignored in public discourse. Historians wrote about the victories of generals and the wisdom of statesmen. They did not write about the women forced to endure punishments too cruel to speak aloud, and so the question lingers: what price was truly paid for the so-called Golden Age of Athens, whose lives were broken to build the city that still dazzles us thousands of years later? Because behind the speeches of freedom and equality, there were women who lived and died in chains. To understand the fate of enslaved women in Athens, we have to step back into the so-called Golden Age. It was the 5th century BCE, when Athens stood at the height of its power. The Persian Wars had ended in victory. The Parthenon rose above the Acropolis as a symbol of strength. Art, drama, and philosophy flourished in ways the world had never seen before. But this brilliance was not shared equally. The word democracy applied only to a narrow group, male citizens born in Athens. Women, foreigners, and enslaved people were excluded entirely. Out of a population of perhaps 300,000, nearly half were enslaved. They were the invisible foundation of the city, keeping its economy and households alive. Slavery in Athens wasn't hidden. It was normal. Markets openly sold human beings alongside livestock and grain. Wealthy families could own dozens of slaves, while even modest households often had one or two. And within this system, enslaved women bore the heaviest burden. They were not just workers, they were symbols of domination. Some ground wheat or wove cloth for endless hours. Others carried water from wells, tended children, or cleaned homes until their bodies gave out. Their lives were not their own. Every hour belonged to someone else. What makes this story more chilling is the contradiction. Athens was proud of its ideals: isonomia, equality before the law; piracy, freedom of speech. Orators and philosophers praised liberty as the highest good. Yet in the same breath, they accepted slavery as natural, even necessary. To them, the freedom of the citizen rested on the subjugation of others. This is the paradox at the heart of Athens, a city hailed as the birthplace of democracy, yet built on a system that denied humanity to nearly half its population. And while men could debate laws in the assembly, the enslaved women who cleaned their homes or warmed their beds had no voice, no rights, no recognition. But slavery in Athens wasn't just about work or silence. It was about control. And when that control was challenged, punishments awaited. Punishments designed not only to break bodies, but to erase resistance itself. In Athens, there was no single path into slavery, only many. Some women were taken as war captives. When Athenian armies sacked enemy cities, the defeated were marched back in chains, their lives reduced to property. Others were victims of piracy, snatched from ships or coastal villages, sold like cargo across the Aegean. Debt, too, could doom a family. When obligations could not be paid, daughters might be sold to cover what numbers could not. And for many, there was no fall into bondage at all. They were simply born into it, inheriting chains as if they were a family legacy. Once enslaved, Women were assigned to tasks that touched nearly every corner of Athenian life. In wealthier households, they worked as domestic servants, cooking, fetching water, cleaning, and tending to children. Others spent their days in textile workshops, weaving the endless flow of cloth that clothed the city. Some were forced into more intimate roles, kept as concubines or companions, their bodies treated as extensions of their master's power. The legal system offered them no protection. Enslaved women were invisible before the law. They could not testify in court except under torture, could not own property, could not marry in any recognized way. They were legally objects, not subjects. Their master had the right to command, to punish, even to dispose of them at will. To resist was to risk annihilation. What made their plight especially cruel was that Athens celebrated law, debate, and civic order. Citizens prided themselves on the rule of reason and justice. Yet this justice stopped abruptly at the threshold of slavery. For the enslaved, there were no courts, no appeals, only the whims of whoever owned them. Some chroniclers hint at the quiet endurance of these women, the songs sung while weaving, the whispers of mothers teaching daughters how to survive. But when endurance gave way to defiance, when a woman tried to flee or refused a command, the system showed its darkest face, because punishment was not just correction, it was terror. A reminder that resistance would be met with cruelty so severe it would echo through every other enslaved life. And when these women resisted, the punishments waiting for them were darker than anything Athenian law admitted in public. When enslaved women resisted in Athens, whether by fleeing, refusing an order, or even showing defiance, the consequences were brutal. Punishment was meant to crush not just the body, but the spirit. The most common tool was the whip. Beatings were a daily reminder of power, delivered not always in anger, but as a matter of routine discipline. Chroniclers mention women forced to work through wounds, their pain considered irrelevant beside their master's convenience. Some bore marks far harder to hide. Branding, the searing of skin with hot irons, was a punishment reserved for those who attempted escape. It stamped shame and ownership onto the body itself, making resistance visible forever. To walk through the streets with such a mark was to carry a scarlet sentence that never faded. There was also a punishment less visible, but no less devastating: forced servitude in intimate ways. Many enslaved women were compelled into sexual submission, not as individuals with desire or choice, but as extensions of their master's will. Ancient writers glossed over this reality, speaking in euphemisms or avoiding it altogether, but the silence itself tells us everything. Their voices were erased so thoroughly that even their suffering became unspeakable. Evidence survives in fragments. Lines from Athenian plays mocking slaves as weak and cowardly. Legal codes treating their testimony as worthless unless extracted under torture. Passing references in speeches that reveal how common their degradation was. But the women themselves left no records. Their stories were filtered through the voices of those who owned them, reducing human lives to caricatures, property, or background details. And yet, if we look closely, we can still sense their presence. The cloth woven in dim workshops, the food served in wealthy homes, the lullabies sung to children not their own, all of it bore the invisible imprint of their endurance. They were everywhere and nowhere, essential but erased. This was not just cruelty hidden behind closed doors. It was part of a larger pattern, a culture where power itself depended on the silencing of the enslaved. What we might see as private acts of brutality were, in Athens, normalized and even sanctioned. Yet this wasn't just private brutality, it was a system that Athens itself normalized. Perhaps the most chilling truth about Athens is that its cruelty toward enslaved women wasn't only private, it was institutional. The state itself sanctioned practices that today we would call barbaric. In Athenian courts, a free man's word was accepted as testimony, but as slaves, worthless, unless it was extracted under torture. This was no metaphor, it was law. To ensure truth, slaves were beaten, whipped, and broken until their words matched what their masters or judges wanted to hear. Women, in particular, were dragged into this machinery of pain, their voices forced out not as testimony, but as screams. Beyond the courtroom, punishment sometimes became spectacle. Runaways might be paraded in chains, branded before a crowd, or subjected to humiliations meant to serve as warnings. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully staged performances of dominance. By making punishment visible, Athens reminded every enslaved person of their place. The message was clear. The city itself stood behind the whip. What made this institutionalized cruelty even more sinister was the way it was justified. Some philosophers argued that slaves were living tools, less than human, naturally destined to serve. Others claimed that freedom for citizens required the bondage of others, that the leisure to think, debate, and create could only exist if someone else labored without rest. In this twisted logic, the suffering of enslaved women became not a crime, but a necessity, an ugly truth hidden beneath the polished marble of the Parthenon. This was Athens at its height, philosophers shaping ideas that would influence the world for millennia, even as they rationalized why some people deserved no humanity. The contradiction is staggering. The same city that celebrated reason and justice institutionalized torment as part of its legal and social fabric. And for enslaved women, this meant there was no refuge, no corner of life untouched by control. Their bodies were labor, their voices instruments of testimony under torture. Their existence reduced to evidence of someone else's power. The very society that gave us democracy had, in its shadows, a machinery of torment. Athens has long been remembered as the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art. Its temples still stand. Its ideas still shape modern governments. Its stories still echo through classrooms and books. But beneath the marble, the brilliance and the myths, lies a contradiction too great to ignore, because Athens was also built on bondage. The voices of enslaved women, silenced, erased, forgotten, were part of the very foundation that allowed citizens to boast of liberty. The city that praised freedom practiced subjugation. The men who wrote about reason and justice accepted torment as a tool of order. To look at this history honestly is not to diminish Athens' achievements, but to refuse to romanticize them at the expense of those who suffered. The women branded, beaten, silenced in courts, and forced into roles they could not choose were not side notes to history. They were human beings whose pain should be remembered as more than a footnote. Their suffering was not the cost of progress, it was cruelty. And cruelty, no matter how long ago, must be named for what it is, a crime against humanity. This contradiction should force us to ask uncomfortable questions about the present. Every society tells stories about its greatness, its innovations, its shining ideals. But what is hidden behind those stories? Who suffers in silence to uphold the systems we celebrate? If Athens could hide such darkness in plain sight, what dark truths might our own age be burying? History has a way of remembering the triumphs of the powerful and forgetting the voices of the powerless. That silence is its own form of violence, which is why, when we look at Athens, we must remember not only the speeches, the temples, and the marble, but also the chains, because history remembers the marble, but it forgets the chains.